Hello everyone, I'm Nupur Goyal from Identity Team at Microsoft, and I'm here today with Alex Simons, CVP Program Management for Identity and Network Access Division at Microsoft. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alex.
Hi, Nupur. It's great to join you.
Alex, it's been quite a ride from over 18 months. What are the biggest risks, or security risk, I should say, that enterprises are seeing today?
Well, I think there's really two big trends we're seeing from our enterprise customers. The first is the move to mobile work styles, right? So especially with COVID quarantines, a huge number of our customers had to really adapt on the fly and find ways to send their employees home and keep them super productive and give them a great home experience, but do so in a way that was secure and compliant, right? And that really stretched a lot of people's capabilities, particularly if they were relying on kind of some of the older perimeter-based networking and VPNs and things like that. That was a really big change and very hard to do. The second biggest change has been really the most recent set of attacks, things like the SolarWinds and Nobelium attacks, right? Like that's a very different kind of attacker. They're very sophisticated and they're attacking entire supply chains. So they're really thinking about attacks in this integrated graph across a whole ecosystem rather than just attacking an individual company or an individual technology at a company. And that's a very different kind of threat and approach than we've seen broadly before.
It's a huge amount of work for business leaders, especially the security team. Everything has changed, especially around how and where we work, correct?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the old world versus the new world, right? Like, if you think about the world we were in before, most of the people you were protecting were employees. Most of the devices were like desktop PCs and laptops. Most of the apps were on premise. It's just a very different world than today, right? And then go even further. You can think about, well, in that world, all of your apps were things in your data center, and now an awful lot of your apps are things in the cloud. And you didn't have to worry about professional kind of nation state attackers. You were just worried about kind of like hackers and script kiddies. So really the world that we live in today is so different than the world of maybe 5 years ago even. And that's why we think it's very important for enterprises to move from kind of that traditional perimeter-based security model to a zero trust model. And for us, we believe there are really three big principles for zero trust. The first is that you have to verify everything explicitly. If you think about the old world, once you were in the perimeter of the network, we kind of assumed you were trusted. In the new world, we want to verify your identity. We want you to be strongly authenticated. We want to make sure you're in the right groups and you have the right attributes and things like that, and your risk profile is low before we let you get to anything. In addition, we want to verify all of the things we can about your device. So we want that device to be well managed. We want it to have the antivirus running and showing that it's clean. We want it to be encrypted and PIN protected. Like all of those things have to be in place too before we let somebody get to anything. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're doing all these things in a least privilege model so that even when we do let you in, you're only really able to get to the applications and data and resources that you need to get your job done, not to everything in the whole company. Right? And so that's really the second. So verify is the first principle. The second principle is always use a least privilege model. And then the third principle is to assume breach, right? Because we know that even in a world where you have great security and you've done everything you possibly can, there's always the chance that an attacker will find a new technique or a new hole that you weren't aware of. So you want to make sure that you're assuming breach and that you're ready with all of the signals and telemetry that you need to be able to see what's going on across your whole estate, and that you've got all of your mitigations planned out and hopefully automated so that when there is an attack and it gets through successfully, you can detect it and then you know what to do to try to mitigate and manage that attack.
So we are seeing zero trust as one of the top priority for a lot of security leaders today. Can you share how customers are implementing it, or maybe give an example or so?
Sure. I mean, you're absolutely right. Every enterprise customer I talk to wants to talk about zero trust. It is the number one topic that I hear about from customers. And they're all, in fact, more than 70% of our customers are already on their way with some kind of zero trust implementation. So super cool. Now, let me tell you about one customer in particular. So take Bridgewater Associates, right? So Bridgewater, more than 2 years ago, had decided, hey, they wanted to enable their employees and their partners and their vendors to be able to take more of a work from anywhere style, right? So rather than having to come into the office, they wanted them to have access everywhere. And so they went back and they reevaluated their security model and decided, hey, they had to move from that traditional perimeter-based model to a zero trust footprint. Right, so that was a big change for them, and they did it before COVID too, so that's pretty cool. Right, so they made the decision to move to the new security model because of their business imperatives and the things they thought they needed to accomplish. Then they went about a very systematic deployment. Right, so the first thing they did was they made sure that everybody was strongly authenticated. So they turned on an MFA requirement for everybody, but they also endorsed and started using a whole bunch of passwordless technologies. So they used Windows Hello on desktops. They used our Authenticator app passwordless capabilities, and they got all of their users to the point where across their employees and their partners and their vendors, everybody has to be strongly authenticated before they can get access. So that was the first part of their journey, and it's a great place to start because it's a really fast way to get a decreased security risk, right? We know that if you get to some kind of strong authentication, you can get yourself away from more than 99% of attacks, right? So that's a big win. The second key piece they did was they went to requiring managed devices for everything, right? So they turned on Microsoft Endpoint Manager. They made all of their employees get their devices into a managed state, whether that was a personal device at home or their phone or a laptop that they were taking home or something like that, right? They had to get them all enrolled in Intune. They had to get them managed. They had to get them into a good state before they were able to access anything, right? And now they're also using Microsoft Defender for Endpoint to prove that the device is in a good state from an antivirus standpoint as well. Right? So that's really the second part of their journey. They started with strong identities and then they moved to requiring devices, right? The third thing they did was they started moving all of their applications, so all of the SSO for their Microsoft applications and their third-party applications, they moved to federating with Azure AD for that. So now there's no way for an employee or a partner or a customer to get into that data without first going through the Azure AD conditional access and all of the checks, right? So move all your applications to use Azure AD for SSO, and then they went in and started implementing conditional access policy for the different levels of security they wanted across those different applications.
So you said SSO for just Microsoft application or all applications?
No, for all of their applications.
Oh,
so
good.
for their cloud applications, for their third-party applications, they went to moving everything. So it's behind one policy engine, and you don't have to worry about, okay, hold on, where are the users getting access from? You can monitor them all from one place. Right?
Okay.
So that's a key piece, got them to that point. Now, they were well on that journey, right? They were well along their zero trust journey before COVID hit. But because they had gotten so far along, they were able to much more rapidly adapt to that kind of remote hybrid work style and get their employees productive at home in just a number of weeks, whereas a bunch of our customers had a much harder time than that. So because they had been on that journey, it gave them a much greater agility and the ability to adapt super quickly when COVID hit. And now they're starting to experiment with our machine learning and AI systems. So they've turned on Microsoft Azure AD Identity Protection, and they're using that to monitor and look for unusual application usage and unusual behaviors, even more, so even more fine-grained than what they're doing with just their conditional access.
Especially with the attacks, the way you talked about the trends, that definitely helps, correct?
Yeah, with these very sophisticated attackers, right? They're attacking both with identities that are the user identities, but they're also attacking with the identities that are essentially the software itself, right? So you really need a system that can look at both what all of your users and their devices are doing, but you also need to be able to look at all of the software services that can access your resources and make sure that that software is not doing unusual things. So it really has to be a comprehensive approach across, kind of all of those points, but really the ability to monitor your workforce identities. If you think about the workload identities, the ones that are your software, that's a new thing, and you want to make sure that you get a good plan in place for that.
That sounds really good, but being very honest, not every organization have all the resources. Bridgewater Associate is a really good example, and not everyone is in the same state. So what's your recommendation for organizations that are trying to start? Because one question that I've heard most of the time is, it's great, but I don't know where and how to start. So what's your recommendation for those?
Yeah, the thing to realize about a zero trust approach is it's not one of these things where you have to eat the whole elephant at one time, right?
True.
You can just start with your plan and gradually improve over time. So the first thing to do is to make sure, and we recommend this to all our customers, make sure that your highly privileged admin accounts require multi-factor authentication. Like that's the first place to start because those are the most dangerous accounts that can do the most damage, right? So turn on multi-factor authentication for all of those, get that working the way that you want it, and then slowly expand that multi-factor authentication out across the rings of your employees, starting with those that have the access to the most important applications, and then roll it out to everybody, right? So that's really the best place to start. You get an immediate bang for the buck because your multi-factor auth or your strong authentication, passwordless strong authentication, gets rid of so much risk for you, right? So I would definitely recommend starting there. And then the second piece is always, hey, let's make sure that every device that's accessing your resources is well managed. So make sure that it's enrolled in Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Make sure that you've got Microsoft Endpoint Defender there, right? Defender for Endpoint, so that you're not only checking that it's encrypted and PIN protected and things like that, but also you want it to be in a clean state from an antivirus standpoint.
Yeah, that's really a good example because zero trust is not all about rip and replace. It can always, like, you need to start somewhere because every action you take is going to help you with your entire security posture.
Exactly. Every step along the way, you reduce your threat surface a little bit more, and it's just a game of keeping at it over time until you've reduced down to the place where you're in a really great state.
Alex, you and I both love zero trust, but what I've heard is customers who are going zero trust are increasingly using multi-clouds. What's your recommendation for them?
Yeah, pretty much every large enterprise in the world is ending up being multi-cloud. Some of them do it intentionally, like that's a strategy where they're like, hey, I'm going to run some stuff in AWS and some in Azure and some in GCP. But some of them, it's unintentional, right? Like a department starts using GCP and they don't realize it, or they make an acquisition and they bring in a whole bunch of stuff running in some cloud that wasn't their main strategy. So every enterprise customer I talk to has that problem, right? The nice thing is that, look, there's great open standards in the identity world that enable us to reach out across all of those different cloud services and give you a great identity experience for that. So like we can use federation like SAML or OAuth tokens and be able to manage and provision users into all of these services. In fact, today, almost 10,000 customers use Azure AD to manage their presence in the AWS cloud.
Oh,
right?
wow.
We're really proud of that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's an area where we do a whole bunch of work. And on any given day, we are provisioning millions and millions of users into services like AWS and Google, Salesforce.com, ServiceNow, like getting that state in place where you are managing all of your users, that they're all protected by conditional access and you have a great governance program in place. It's really important that enterprises are able to get to that really secure place across their entire multi-cloud deployment, right? So it's not just about Microsoft, it's about everything.
Yeah.
And one of the coolest new things we've just had is a new acquisition of Microsoft, a company called CloudKnox. So CloudKnox is a service for looking at all of your entitlements across AWS, GCP, Azure, and your on-premise VMware deployments.
Wow.
So it gives you a really comprehensive view of everything, and you can set up all of your privileges on all your resources exactly the way you want, and then monitor them for creep over time to make sure that, like we were talking about, you don't get expansion of least privilege, that you always stay in that least privilege state, and that you know your important resources aren't open or exposed in ways that you wouldn't want them to be. So really that whole thing, you got to get your single sign-on and federation working, you got to get provisioning working, and then you got to have a monitoring service to make sure that all those resources across your whole multi-cloud estate stay in that least privileged state. And we can do all of that with our Azure AD and CloudKnox resources.
That's really good to know. Any last advice for organizations that are still thinking about whether the zero trust is the right approach from them or not, or whether they don't even realize that they're already in the zero trust journey?
Yeah, I think everybody who wants to compete for talent, right? Like you just have to realize that it's not just a security thing, right? It's about getting the best and brightest talent to come work in your corporation. And increasingly around the world, if you look at places like Microsoft, Amazon today announced this, all kinds of companies are now offering this kind of flexible work style where people can work remotely, they can work hybrid, they can work at work. And if you want to be able to compete for the best and brightest talent in the world, you've got to get a great security compliance story in place to support those kinds of employees. And so I think it's one of those things that even if you've been hesitant in the past, that it's pretty clear now, look, you better get to a zero trust footprint so that you can support both the modern security model that you need in terms of protecting yourself from nation state actors, but also being able to compete for talent, right? In a world where talent, especially high-tech talent, is super rare. Right, and so I would just encourage everybody, look, it's time to move from thinking about it to getting started on your plan. And like we were saying earlier, look, the easiest and first thing to do is always just go turn on MFA, right? And that will dramatically decrease your security threat and then get you to a place where then you can start making other incremental investments that make sense.
That was all really great insights. Thank you so much for your time today, Alex. You have an amazing one.
Oh, awesome. Thanks, Nupur. Thanks for the opportunity. It was really great to talk with you. And it's just super fun to get a chance to share all this information about Zero Trust.
For sure. Thanks, Alex.